All right. Good morning, everybody. Happy Saturday. It is time to let it rip. We have one that's sure to garner some opinions and all of that. It's definitely going to be an eventful one. But before we get to all of that, a couple of things at the top. We are going to be talking about topics that can be very sensitive to discuss. We are going to be talking about gun rights, and I'm sure gun violence is going to come up and things like that. So just so you are aware of the subject matter at hand today, along the way. As always, even else, I should say, especially with the more controversial topics, this show really thrives on engagement from you all. So, as we are going through these things, as we are walking our way through the subject matter, as always, we want you to chime in down below. Let us know where you are tuning in from and also what you have to say along the way. Of course, usually is perfectly fine, but with a topic like this, it bears mentioning. Let's just keep it cool in the comments. We've all got opinions, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with having an opinion, but just because you have an opinion doesn't mean that you can't cooperate with other people who may have different opinions than yourself. And that is something that I hope is on vibrant display this morning. So, um, we are jumping in, and full disclosure, this is probably going to go a little bit different than originally, because I'm jumping in hosting. But Rico and I have had this conversation elsewhere over on his show, which if you haven't checked out The Cross, absolutely do that. um we've had this conversation in different forms along the way. It's kind of understood that there are aspects of this that we agree on wholeheartedly, but also ones that we definitely do not agree on. But even though it seems like even though it seems like Mount Everest to talk about sometimes, because it can be such an emotional topic of conversation for a lot of folks. Um, it's certainly one that, with just the tragedies of the recent couple of weeks, feels like it needs to be talked about, because every time that something like this happens, it's the same cycle starts. You've got your group that uses this as a springboard to immediately jump to their platforms and start talking about regulations, take the guns away from everybody, all of that jazz. Likewise, you have a group of people that sees tragedies like this and takes to their platforms and springboards immediately to, well, if there was just an armed guard, or if one teacher had a gun or something, some version thereof, that if there were the right people with guns in that situation, then nothing would have happened and tragedy would have been averted. And it's weird, because it feels like there have been versions of this even within the secular world that I have watched on repeat since the first time that I remember this being a really prevalent topic of conversation back in 99 with Columbine. So so we start off the question, what do we do with all this, right? Like we, as Christians, yeah, we'll I'm sure along the way, we got a long walk to road, or a long walk to road. Yeah, I'm just leaving it. This morning. And so I'm sure we will get to the nitty-gritty of opinions and stances and all of that jazz. But Rico, you are somebody that carries themselves with a high level of, integrity, right? Like, you are just somebody that you care about honoring your responsibilities and honoring God and all of those kinds of things. So as we start to process what we make of guns and how we think about them, and whether or not, like, as the old cliche goes, God forbid it ever happens where you're in a situation where, that, like, your life is at risk and all of that. How can we start to unpack this in a God honoring way?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would like to say is my condolences go to anybody who's been a victim of gun violence
Yeah.
or. So I, as I get older, I'm trying to be more like my wife, be a little bit more empathetic, right, and stuff, and not
Yeah.
be so hardcore. I grew up without a father, and my mom, I felt like overly tried to teach me what it means to be a man because I didn't have a man to teach me. And then I joined the military, and I was a cop in the military, so that probably added more to my masculinity or whatever. But then I became a Christian, and I started realizing that some things. I could probably operate with a little bit more grace and a little bit more empathy. So I definitely want to, I definitely want to say, I want to be empathetic and show grace to people who maybe have, who's hurting from this. And so my prayers go out to you all. And so I think that's the first way we can, operate in this conversation in a godly way is to remember that we're talking about human beings, people, God's children, God's people, and they're hurting and they're going through things, and so we live in a fallen world, and so prayer, showing empathy. That's one thing. Also, two, I think the other thing is we have to really ask ourselves, um, do we believe what Jesus says, and believe Jesus' teachings when it comes to dealing with our enemies? So when people do wrong, right, and people and it's clearly wrong, we have a hard time forgiving them and showing them grace as well, right? I'm reminded of this one I saw on social media, but this cop had killed this black guy brother. And the family was mad. Everybody was sad. The country was in uproar. But the little boy, the little brother, in the courtroom told the judge, "Hey, I want to forgive her. I don't want to see anything bad happen to the cop." And then he asked the cop, "Can he hug her?" And he showed, even though she took his brother away from him, he showed a lot of grace and forgiveness towards her. But a lot of people, even Christians, was like, "Man, forget that. You see, we in the black community are too forgiving and we always turning the other cheek and blah, blah, blah." But this is what Jesus tell us to do. And it's a hard thing to do when you're being wrong. And so, again, I want to just start with empathy and say that, yeah, even though I try to be a person of integrity and I believe what the Bible say, I fall short all the time of it. And I don't know if I was in that boy's position, would I have shown that much love and grace. But that's what I strive to do because that's what the Bible tell me to do. So I think that's where I'll start at with that. And then when it comes to the whole guns thing and violence and stuff, it's unfortunate. But if I just had to quickly give my stance on where I'm at, I think people should be able to defend themselves. Is where I would land.
Right.
Now, to what degree? I think we're going to get into that a little bit more, and I'll share a little bit more why I land that way. But that's typically where I land. But that doesn't. But again, I preference all that other stuff first to say, even if I have a right to defend myself and a right, and if that even means me having a gun to do that, my first step should not be automatically using the gun to harm and to kill. Matter of fact, I just get to it now. One of the things they taught us as cops, which is why I get very frustrated when I see cops shoot unarmed people and kill unarmed people, is the very first thing they taught us was the use of force model. The use of force model simply says you use the lowest amount or the reasonable amount of force to eliminate a threat, right? And so if somebody's just yelling and talking crazy to me, I don't jump to shooting them, right? But if they're causing if they can cause a potential death and harm to me or civilians or whatever, then I can use the amount of force to stop that threat. And so that's kind of where I stand. That's how I was trained. That's where I stand. And I think the Bible gives room for me to operate that way because and I'll use this one final example. I remember seeing a clip of this kid who tried to rob this guy. And tried to break into this guy's car or something like that, break into his house. Well, the guy was armed. He came out. He had this gun on the kid. He didn't shoot him or kill him, but he said, "Hey, man, let's talk. Put the gun down. What is going on? I was in your shoes." And so, even though he had his weapon to defend himself and his family, he showed grace and love to that boy, talked to him, didn't call the police, and potentially probably changed that boy's life around, right? And so again, I think there's a way to defend yourself, defend your family, but then also operate with the love and compassion that Jesus called us to.
Right. Right. I'm glad that you started it off acknowledging, because I think oftentimes it's so, and I have found myself being guilty of blowing past taking the moment to offer the condolences for the people at ground zero of the tragedy, right?
Yeah,
um and it's heartbreaking that there's so many that you almost become desensitized to the fact that this is just a regularity, like to the point where there is currently what most believe it is a scam, but there is an image going across different school districts. It looks like it was a meme that was taken out, and somebody in different local areas took a list of local school districts out and replaced it with local school districts for their area, and it's going around that like, oh, this list was found, and all this jazz. Like it's a meme, like on a, you know what I
yeah,
mean? And it is easy. I like you have also been on a journey of maybe tempering it back. I still have plenty of opinions to go around. I still have plenty of passion to go around, but taking a beat before jumping in and immediately getting to, oh, I need you to hear me and my stance and why I think this is wrong or that is wrong or this is right or that is right. Because I think that's exactly where conversations like this fall to pieces. And when I was in the throes of that model of I would call it conversation, but it really wasn't. Um, I would have never been able to sit here on a stream with you all watching with an ex cop talking about gun rights. This would have never happened. I promise you that. And so I like to take the moments just being honest about the humanity that's involved in being a pair of talking heads on the internet, talking about gun rights and all of that sort of stuff, or talking about this topic or that topic. I like to take the moments to acknowledge the work of the Holy Spirit in the situation. And especially with Rico and I both have tempered over the last couple of years that we've known each other, and so it's cool to see the progression of time and the progression of our characters when hitting topics like this. um so I would say it's probably fair and one of the easier on ramps to take that neither one of us is out here waving our hands in the air talking about how it is God's mandate
yeah. No,
for us to arm ourselves, for us to like not to defend ourselves, because I think when I'm using that phrase defend myself, I am definitely using it differently than how you used it with what you say. It's less about love your neighbor first and more about your strength as a Christian is determined by how many enemies that you can vanquish, kind of isolating out kind of the mentality of the Old Testament and trying to superimpose that on the modern day. And there is a whole subsection of Christianity that takes topics like this and uses them as a prime opportunity to say, this is why it's God's mandate for us to have guns, for us to, and that tends to springboard into vote a certain way, act a certain way, only acknowledge some as our neighbors, stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely not leaning that way. And I definitely don't like. To be honest, I think you'll be very hard pressed, especially in the New Testament, to have that argument. Like,
Yeah.
if anything, if anything, you got to go hard to go against pacifism, right? Because Jesus is so forgiving. Jesus called us to be that way. So I'm definitely not leaning towards that way. And two, I think a lot of times too people think just because I served in the military and I was a cop or whatever that I'm a little bit more the way you describe those people.
Yeah.
But I'm actually not. I'm not that huge. I'm not a huge patriotic type of America first type of person. I'm not a huge now. Don't get me wrong. I love America. I got a flag literally tattooed on my arm. I'm grateful that I live in a country where I'm free to worship God and I can take care of my family and we can
Yeah.
afford to. We can go to sleep at night without having to worry about bombs and guns and all that stuff going off where we live at. So I don't want to say that, but I remember my first day in basic training. They set us down and asked everybody why did we join, and there was a lot of people because I joined right shortly after 9/11, and there was a lot of people ready to go and get some vengeance for 9/11. Me, I joined to take care of my family. Now and everybody in that room gave different reasons of why they joined. And some people who are very patriotic feel like if you're not patriotic, then you shouldn't have joined or whatever. But the reality of it is, it's not a matter of why you do something; it's what you do once you get there and how you perform and that kind of stuff, right? And so, people may be surprised by that, but I'm not like that. Also, too, when it comes to politics, I am. Like I watched the debate the other day. I'm just personally very saddened, disappointed to kind of where our country is kind of got. I think we're so divided. I think people we're like, for example, what we're doing here. Me and you disagree on a few things, but we can come together and talk, right? But I think we're at a point in our country now where, like, if you don't think the way I think, then you're automatically my enemy, and I got to get over on you and whatever. And that to me is sad, man. And it's sad our choices that we have when it comes to our leadership, right? And so I'll never be that person to get on here and say it's God's given right for us to eradicate all evil here.
Yeah.
Because if anything, God told us to pray for them, love them, and it's going to be that love that's going to help bring them to know Him. And so that is what we're called to do. So that's why I want to make sure I steer this conversation more so from a viewpoint of defending
Yeah.
yourself from people who said, you know what, above all else, I want to do you harm. I want to cause evil to you or to innocent people. And I do think that the Bible does give room for us to protect widows, to protect, love, and take care of widows, orphans, the less fortunate, the homeless, and the people who can't defend themselves, right? And then I think this is, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think this is kind of where we steer off a little bit. I do believe that God, I'm trying to think how I want to say this. I do believe that God do put government, law enforcement, into power for a reason, to kind of help, basically to defend, and they have the authority to punish evil, right? And so I believe that Romans 13 give a case for that. And again, that's why I want to preface. I'm not this super over political kind of person. I think that if somebody goes out and, let's say they're a serial killer, right? God has put in place police officers to to stop that serial killer, and that's their duty to do that. And so that's an example of what I mean when I say that.
Um, yeah. So first off, to the topic, like we could just sit here and beat up the stance of it's God's it's God that gave us the mission to have guns and all of that jazz and to eradicate all evil. We could sit here and beat up on that, but that will, I promise you, for all of you watching, that will get old because we largely agree, right? And that's something that I was, when Ant pitched the idea to me for us to talk about gun rights when it was on your show. I was like, this true grit, red, white, and blue dude and I are not gonna. This is not gonna work. Like this is you're seriously putting oil in water because I had a stereotype. You hear words, you hear titles, you hear those things, and I had a stereotype, and I'm very honest about that because I want to give people permission to be able to be honest about that, to be able to say that some bad actors have given you an impression of what everybody who holds that title is like and what that entire thing, and don't get me wrong, when it comes to the system, oh, I have so many opinions, but we have to remember, regardless, and this is true for so many different points in this conversation, that there's another person involved. Whether it's the cop, whether it's the person who believes that everybody should have guns, whether it's the people who believe that nobody should have guns. Regardless, there's people. And that's
And not to cut you
very,
off, but Anthony always bring up too, those people thoughts may come from their experience and what they've been through, right?
yep,
Their viewpoint may come from that too. So I'm sorry not to cut you off.
yep. And so that part of it, for a full breakdown of the verses, like if you're hearing this and you're like, what verses could people possibly use to defend this, go to ministrymisfits.com. Andrew wrote a full article breaking down the most commonly used verses that would be proponents for that sort of hyper patriotic, hyper conservative, hyper gun right sort of mentality. So transitioning, yeah, there are some things that I can say I've cooled off on how widespread my opinions tried to be and how many different scenarios and situations it tried to account for and try to be a little bit more nuanced as far as these kinds of conversations. So I have held off. 23 minutes into it, I will finally give my stance. It should be no surprise to anybody. I am a raging pacifist. And this is coming from somebody who more multiple weight class champion in mixed martial arts, experienced boxer, coached the whole nine yards. Like I am a martial artist. I am a strength athlete. I This was not always the status quo for me. It was never necessarily about guns specifically. It was more about you settle problems with your fists rather than like settling it with a weapon. So I guess I've always had a little bit of a bias towards, man, if you were a real man, you wouldn't need that gun or you wouldn't need that weapon or something along those lines. The older I've gotten, the more time, the more I've matured, the less the less angry I am, the more I've transitioned into, um, 9.999 times out of 10, a situation can be de escalated if you understand how to de escalate a conversation or a situation. I don't want to just say conversation. Yes, conversation. But even when it's not like, as simple as a conversation, it can still be de escalated most of the time without needing to engage in elevate the situation by introducing a weapon. Because whether or not you're defending yourself, whether you are perpetrating the act, whatever role you play in the situation, the person that introduces a weapon has now escalated the situation, oftentimes beyond a point of being able to de-escalate it. Now, again, we can sit here and go around about how warranted it all is and all of that jazz, but I take that, for me, I take that and I couple that with a fundamental lack of confidence in the morality structures of human beings. Now, there are some of you that know me face to face that are watching this right now. I see, because I know exactly where you're tuning in from. So it's you will get a chance to hear me say this, because I usually only say this online. I am a pastor that barely holds to the confines of organized religion, mainly because I have seen what organized religion does in the hands of man, and I ask the same question that I have asked about concepts, about power structures, about physical, tangible objects. Who's responsible enough to hold the gun? Because morality is subjective. We want to believe that right and wrong are absolutes. As Christians, we want to believe that right and wrong are absolutes. They are
No.
100% not.
Nope.
That's why I put zero stock into this idea of a morality structure that automatically means, oh, this is a good person. And so now they're walking around with the ability to use this gun and to pull this gun and to do all this. And again, we say, like, humanity says that they're good. To quote the great philosopher, the Joker, all it takes is one bad day. It's all it takes. And so I take a step back when trying to process this situation, rather than just specifically looking at it from one side or the other. I try to, how in the early 2000s every procedural seemed to have the same exact area, like this pseudo high tech hologram area where they could look at a room from all directions and all of that. That's the approach that I try to take with this argument, and take a step back from being entrenched in a stance to, if this thing has the power to cause widespread devastation and it levels the playing field by taking it out of the equation, that then at what point does utilitarianism start to kick in? At what point do we recognize that in the midst of giving it to, I don't know, we'll call them responsible people, since we've shot holes in the morality argument, we'll say responsible people. And that's assuming that it's an area that actually requires any kind of rigorous licensing or testing or anything or training in order to hold a gun or be able to carry around a gun. In the midst of allowing those people to have a firearm, we've opened the door for all of these other people to be able to have a gun so very easily. At what point do we admit there's a problem here?
Yeah. So, um, there, like you said, morality is so subjective, right? And I think unless God Himself in the Bible said this is what it is and this is how I view it, unless He directly talked about it, there can be subjectivity on morality, right? Um, And so then even with gun rights, like, okay, so let's just say we say people do have the right to bear arms, but do they need a fully automatic weapon? You know, even that gets subjective on how much you need. This is my simple how I view it. And this may be and I found this out, man, just having conversation with different kind of people. So I remember I had this conversation with I had a conversation, not this conversation, but a conversation with my former boss when I was working at UGA, and one of my coworkers, and they're two white males. I don't think either one of them were believers, but that's kind of irrelevant to what I'm about to say right now. But we were talking about, I can't even remember what we were talking about, but I could just tell from their perspective, they lived a lifestyle that was completely different than mine. So their reality and their viewpoint on seeing stuff was so far different than mine that I realized that no matter what I said, they're not going to see things my way.
Right.
Then my brother-in-law, my wife's brother, he vegan. You know, I wouldn't really necessarily call him a pacifist or anything like that because I'm pretty sure he owns a gun, but he is very like caring, loving for people. Don't feel like people should. You know, he's a very just happy go lucky kind of guy, and definitely when it comes to animals, right? Because he's a vegan and that kind of stuff. And I remember talking to him, and I could tell his view on life comes from where he grew up at, what he was around, and what he's seen. And so does mine. Now, the good thing about me, I won't say the good thing, but the benefit that I had was I grew up in Atlanta, uh, in places where crime was really bad, drugs was really bad, people did very bad things, people acted a certain way. The way we interacted with police officers was one bad way. Matter of fact, before I joined the military, I was beat by a police officer at the age of 17, to the point I was throwing up blood the whole night. And then he had a tow truck driver drop me off at the next exit. They took my car and my mom had to come get me. Right. So this was my experience with cops before I became a cop, which is one of the reasons why I decided to become a cop. I figured, hey, if I'm a cop, they can't do that to me. But then once I became a cop and I was around other kind of people from all over the world, I realized that my world in Atlanta was just my world in Atlanta, and people deal with a bunch of different things. And so I bring all of that up to say it's easy for somebody who has never had to be in a place where you really need to protect yourself from evil people, right? Like me, I've never been to prison. So somebody in prison, I'm sure your skills that you got is going to go a long way in prison because you are certified. You will be able to defend yourself in a place where there are people who literally want to do you harm every single day. You see what I'm saying? And so if you were in that situation, your view on protecting yourself is going to look a lot different than a joker who never been in that situation. You see what I'm saying? And so coming from places where drugs are bad, people are bad, people, like I remember when I was in elementary school, I had to fight literally every single day coming home from the bus stop because there were kids who mom was a crackhead. They didn't have no money. Their mom, like they had nobody taking care of them. So they would try to steal our money, our lunch money, our candy money. This is back in the day when we had candy ladies where you can go to the store with $1 and just get pickles and candy. And so we would have a little change for the candy lady. And every day I had to fight to keep it. Either if I didn't fight, I lose it. Right. Or, and so again, that's why I want to start off by saying you got to realize these are people, and people thoughts on this come from their experiences, right? And so if I'm living in an area where I need to defend myself, it's kind of hard for me to sign up to say, take my guns away. And the reason why is because a criminal can care less. A criminal is going to get a weapon, a gun, a tool, whatever they got to do what they're gonna do to break the law. And so so my view on it, I think is extreme to say take it completely away from law-abiding citizens. I won't call them responsible. I won't call them moral. I won't call them good. I'll say people who want to follow the law, right? Who just literally just want to be left alone and follow the law. You take the guns away from them. there's still a bunch of people out there who can care less about following the law. And some people are around that a lot more often than others. Like right now where I live, which again, I thank God for this every night that I can go to sleep in a house where I feel safe. And then for the longest time we lived on base. So we had a gate guard or whatever. But my oldest son who lives in Arizona right now, he's living with his grandma, but typically he lives in bad areas because he chose to kind of do things on his own. So he lives in a place where your house get broken into, your car get broken into, people are trying to rob you, people are trying to kill you, and there's kids and people who have to live through that every day. And so if I'm a father just trying to live my regular citizen life,
Mhm.
but I can't afford to live somewhere where the police will protect me, where the police will come super fast if an alarm go off a fire off, because there's some places where it takes forever for the police to show up. So then, do you not protect yourself? And then this is the final point that I'll make on this. This is why I brought up the use of force at first, because as a trained fighter, if you got into a fight and beat up somebody bad, the courts are gonna handle you a little bit more strict than somebody who don't. So I think if we just look at the gun as a tool, then that kind of changes a tool for use of force model that changes it, because what you can do with your hands alone, right,
Mhm.
puts you at a high, and I'm not saying make it even or whatever. I'm just saying you got to have restraint not to do what you could do with your hands. Just like the person who owns the gun got to have, and so that goes back to use of force. You do the minimum amount of force to stop
Yeah.
the threat, right? And so again, it's so subjective. We can talk circles all the way around it.
Mhm.
But if you are a trained cold fighter, right, and somebody breaking your house, you can also cause deathly bodily harm. And then the question goes back, should you have went that far? And so then the same thing goes with the person with the gun. I could cause deathly body harm, but should I have went that far? And so
Right.
that's kind of where I stand on it. I think once you take the guns away from law-abiding citizens, now the criminals who don't care about that, you just put them in a huge disadvantage.
Yeah, I the that's the typical response that I would hear from somebody who can think level-headedly but has a proclivity towards the right to bear arms. And it's reasonable. Like it's a fully reasonable thing to say, because it is not a magic fix it all to just say let's take the guns away from everybody. And that's why, again, that nuance factor needs to play into how we address these things. And that's part of where i have I guess softened my heavy hand a little bit, um because the idea is, if you ratchet it back enough, I'm saying for somebody who would then double down and say, yeah, no, take them from everybody, is the idea is you keep closing the valve of the water supply more and more and more, and eventually water can't get out of the valve. That eventually the supply will start to become scarcer and scarcer and things like that. I think it's a flawed argument. I do. But so that's why, as I have processed this, and I have I and really, anytime that I talk about that I'm it's usually Andrew who gets me in front of the mic to talk about this sort of thing. And it's generally out of the standpoint of how should we as Christians address the thought process of an intruder, of a combatant, of somebody who we perceive to be against us. Because generally, if there is a misalignment in one of the more extreme sides, that can generally be traced back to a fundamental aspect of how one views another person. especially one who has done something to declare themselves an enemy of your well-being, your family's well-being, so on and so forth, all that. So I grew up in a weird duality. Spent a lot of time in Philly, which for those of you that don't know, for the uninitiated, especially back in the '90s, the cops were non-existent. I you just it was nonsense in there during the '90s, but and I bounced from there to rural northeastern Pennsylvania, where in an entirely different way, the cops were good old boys, and you better hope that it wasn't a real serious emergency, because unless you were a buddy, you were spending anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour waiting to get any kind of response, even if you lived right next to the police station. And so and I know because I used to live not far from the police station, and it took like 40, like, I'm just saying. But I ended up, when I moved out of Pennsylvania, I've lived all over God's green earth, but um my favorite spot that I have ever lived, hands down, was in St. Paul, Minnesota. And you want to talk about living in, like, I didn't take people seriously at first when people heard that I lived on the east side of St. Paul, and everybody was like, "Oh, you live in the hood." I'm like, it's not bad, because in multicultural communities like that, be a part of the community. If you are somebody, especially a white guy, moving into a multi-ethnic community, and you want to ingratiate yourself to the community and be a part of the community, just say hello. Seriously, introduce yourself, go shake hands, go make yourself known in that community. It will go leaps and bounds. So I didn't think about it in terms of, because when I was in Philly, I lived in the hood, and it didn't feel the same. Um but the more time I spent there, absolutely, like, yeah, had a home invasion situation take place. And yeah, I'm not gonna lie, there is a measure of, when you speak out of your own experience, it's easier for you to get to your conclusion than if you're speaking from somebody else's experience. Because while I have, at this stage of my life, as I sit here in my mid 30s, I can sit here and tell you that I have a deeper appreciation for Pennsylvania than I ever thought I would. I have developed wonderful relationships with wonderful people out here now. Um, but my early years in the state formed what I saw was possible from a cop, or from the system, or from law enforcement. When you're a big dude and you get accused of being angry, and you're all of 18 and getting pulled out of the car and have a gun to your head by a cop, that forms how you think about people in that role, and it will also have ripple effects on how you feel about people who can freely carry around weapons. Couple that with the fact that the county that I was originally from, you could get a gun permit for $5 and a tic tac. All you needed to do was fill out a form, and they sometimes held a class that you had to go to that was 2 hours long, and then you were good. Nothing else. There was no, and I understand it's not universal. I understand that's not something that's handled at a national level. Um, though there's part of me that thinks that it should. If we're going to have the things, at least, I don't know, have something more than what exists to act as a stopgap measure. So that way, the people who can carry these things are actually held to that level of responsibility that comes with carrying one of those things. Because I double down on everything that I said before, that I don't care if you're a cop or a criminal or somewhere in between or just some schlep that's trying to defend their house. You introduce a weapon, you've escalated the conversation. The whole situation is different the second that you introduce that into the equation. And then that's when you start to get into the psychology in those heat of the moment moments. Cause like I have come to have a great appreciation for my father-in-law. He is a strong man who has stuck by his family and all this jazz by any standard of measurement, salt of the earth type, and all that kind of stuff. But he'll tell you he is very open about the fact that about his appreciation for guns and all of that, and he'll be the first one to tell you, you pull it, you use it. Done. That's the end of the conversation. Like you pull it, you use it, and that we can sit here and talk about what our rights are, what our should be's are, what people ought to do, and all of that sort of stuff. The thing that I can't get over when trying to process the conversation is the door that gets opened to the psychology of the moment, regardless of whether or not you're from coming from the virtuous position of I'm just trying to defend, I'm just trying to defend. Yeah, again, I acknowledge the where my slants are because I man, you don't I'm as my uncle would say, I'm a peaceful humble man. I just want peace. I want peace in my life. Dude, you come through my front door. I have the ability to be able to defend myself without the use of weapons. Yes, that colors my perspective a little bit because most of the time I don't need one. Just again, I'm being honest because we have to be able to be honest to be able to have authentic conversations and couple that with listening skills so that way we can actually have discourse back and forth and we alleviate ourselves from the pressure of, oh, by the end of this, I need Rico to understand why he's wrong about having guns. No, that's not what we're talking about here. We're honestly kicking the can around about things like the depths of where that line should be or what the psychology is in that moment. And is that psychology of something like you pull it, you use it? Is that a sin? Is that something that actually goes against the teachings of Christ?
Yeah, I think if you just black and white, cut and dry, you pull it, you use it. I believe that is a sin, me personally, because there's so many factors that can take place once or if you pull it or don't pull it. So in the true black and white sense, you pull it, you use it. Yeah, I believe that would be a sin if that was your mentality. At the same time, too, I think it depends on how you view it too, right? So we were taught gun safety, how to handle a weapon, the whole nine or whatever, and we were taught you don't point your weapon at anything that you don't intend to shoot. And so then if you're looking at it from that viewpoint, if I end up pointing my weapon, then I'm in a situation where I do intend on using it. So again, that can even get subjective on what somebody mean when they say that. Which is why I keep going back to the whole use of force model, because what that talks about is you just use a reasonable amount of force to stop the threat. And I think you gave a version of that when you said, hey, once you pull that weapon, you've already escalated to another different level. So you got to be very wise on if and when you need to pull a weapon. No different than you have to be wise on if you're going to use a certain chokehold or a certain move on somebody that could, like, because like there's a chokehold where you can, if you hold it long enough, right? If fighters know this, if I hold a certain chokehold long enough, you're going to be brain dead, which is the reason why in most fights, the referee will see when somebody stop, they go and, you got the option to tap out one, then the referee got the option to come and stop you from doing it because you could render somebody brain dead with a certain chokehold, right? Which would get you in just as amount of trouble in the court of law as it would if you would have used a gun on them. And so to me, I think now we're getting to the theological, I guess, conversation piece of it, because we do know that Jesus does teach us to love our enemies, to pray for our enemies, to leave room for God's vengeance. And so whether you have a gun or whether you have a knife or whether you have a hammer or whether you have your fist, you still need to, as a Christian, right? We still need to operate in a way to say, hey, this person, I'm not going against the flesh. It's the enemy at work here. And ultimately, God's will is for this person to be saved and to show God's grace. So is this a situation where I can show the grace of God, where I can respond a little differently than this person will expect me to act? Now, here's the thing. Especially you'll learn when you become like a leader, right? In military and that kind of stuff. There's you handle different situations on what's going on. So for example, if I'm in charge of a team and we got to say, okay, guys, we just got to move this equipment from here to the other side of the base or whatever, right? In that scenario, as a leader, I can brainstorm. I can have time to talk to my different team members. We could talk about how you want to do it versus, hey guys, we got to get this equipment from here to over there because the enemy is currently shooting at us. Now, as a leader, I got to sit back and say, I don't have time for everybody's opinion. We're going to do it this way and it's going to happen. I think you got to have that happens too when you're in a scenario where you have to defend yourself. So if I'm in a scenario where I can talk to my enemy, I can pray for my enemy, I can say, hey, enemy, hey God, listen, I understand that you're upset or whatever. Let's try to talk this out as men, or let's try to handle it a certain way. Then yeah, in that case, even though he's my enemy, even though he may have even came to do me harm, I should be able to assess that threat and say, do I pull my weapon or do I not, right?
Right.
Now, in a different scenario, I come in and a guy is actively trying to kidnap my kid, or this guy's in the act of raping my child, or he's actively doing. Now, the way I respond to that is going to be completely different than how I respond to another scenario. And so it's not a black and white thing. And so I think we got to go to Jesus' teaching and say, okay, based on biblical teaching and wisdom that we get from God, how do I, as a Christian, handle the situation? And then God know your heart, so you gotta be honest. Am I ready to just shoot this person because I'm afraid? Because fear is a sin, right? So am I acting out of fear? So am I acting out of revenge? Am I acting out of hatred? Am I acting out of like pride, trying to show that I'm bigger? Or am I truly, genuinely trying to stop the threat at hand, right? What is genuinely in my heart? And I think that's what the Bible is, a heart matter. And I believe the reason why Jesus had the teaching he had, because especially in the Old Testament, the heart matter was, and the law for that fact, was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And so, we as humans, we automatically have, I'm not going to let you get over on me. I got to show that I'm right or whatever. I'm not going to. And so that's our default. And I think what Jesus is trying to instill in us, and the Holy Spirit want to instill in us, is to say, hey, love can overcome these things, right? Love, if you operate with love to your enemy, then that person can now become a brother instead of an enemy. But I don't think that's the case in every scenario. And so then it comes down to, all right, I'm a Christian. How should I handle this scenario, whatever it is, as a Christian? So that's kind of where I stand. And I try my best, because I was like you, Joe. I try my best to not stereotype people, even though your experiences will make you can make you do that. Because to this day, I am still because it was a state trooper who beat me. So to this day, when I see a state trooper, I get nervous. I get scared. Now this state trooper could be the most pacifist, nicest person. I don't know this guy from Sam
Yep.
Adams, but I see that state trooper car, I immediately go back to what the state trooper did to me, and that's what I'm thinking. But then when I just talk about my own police experience, there were some cops that I worried. I'll admit it. I got into a fight with a guy because he had the mentality of I can't wait to get to Iraq and kill all of them because they're all whatever, whatever. And so I took that as well. If this was back in the Civil War time or slavery time, you would be like, I can't wait to kill all black people. So to me, I know that there are cops and people who have power who abuse it, and their biases gets in effect of what they do. But then there are also some who just there to feed their family, who there to uphold the law, who there to actually, be a pillar in their community. And so I try not to stereotype people because at the end of the day, inside that state trooper car on the other side of that badge there is a person, and I don't really know that person from Sam Adams and what that person believes, but it's hard when
Yeah.
you've been in a situation where a state trooper beat me. I had no help. I had nothing I could do if I would have responded. He had the gun on me. He told me he would kill me, right? He said it. And so now you can't help that whenever you're back in that situation to immediately relive that, because now I got to think, okay, well, what do I need to do now to to protect myself and keep myself alive in this situation? So anyhow, I think it's not a black and white thing. I think it's a, you gotta especially as Christians, we gotta operate with wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. I and you get to a certain point, and I think life is a continuous cycle of, you know, you get into your 20s and you think you've got it all figured out, and you get into your 30s and you deal with something that came up in your 20s and you were like, oh man, I thought I dealt with that in my 20s. And then you get to your 40s and, oh man, I thought I dealt with that in my 30s, and so on and so forth. um I think that's always in some form or fashion something that we have to wrestle with. And you get to this point of, you think you've made a certain amount of progress on this thing, and then you're tested on it. Neighbor of mine, oh, I warn people whenever they're like, yeah, let's go out for a run. I'm like, you're gonna get stopped every 30 seconds. It's probably gonna get another, hey pastor, hey, and because I have lived here for years now, because I have invested in this community, because I'm for this community and I care about the people of this community, and likewise this community took me in. Dude, had great conversations with him multiple times, struck it up, the whole 9 yards. I happened to be I happened to be going past right as he's getting home from, I'm presuming, work. Dude's a cop. Had no idea. I had no idea that this dude was a cop, and he was in his full get up and all that. Um, and I had a moment of hesitation. At that moment, I could have let our relationship change because he was a cop. If I would have given into those feelings, then fundamentally I would have backed away from him for that same exact reason. You see the uniform, or you see the car, or you see this, like, that's part of why so much of what I've where my perspective has shifted to is raging against the machine, because there's individuals who, some are perfectly fine individuals, other ones are menaces to society. They are like the end of a branch of a giant tree that allows for the bad fruit to be able to be at the end of the tree. There's all this tree that produces the ability for people to be able to take up that badge and take up that gun and walk around like a demigod. And if you get in their path, woe betide, because you are not, now granted, the world has at least evolved a little bit where cameras are a thing and all this jazz, but there's still, we have seen that the opportunity still exists for bad actors to be able to do what they are going to do. I say all of that, and now's where I pick up that thread that you dropped earlier on in the conversation about God putting, police and putting a stopgap measure and all that kind of stuff. Oh, I'm gonna upset somebody when I say this, so please understand this is coming with a measure of love and just honesty. Any soldier, any cop, any defense personnel acts as an example of how humans have gotten it wrong and how it shouldn't have been post the fall. That's a reality. It wasn't intended for there to need to be a military with missiles and guns and all the armament in the whole wide world, and these police officers and all of that. Did humanity fall, and then through a series of events we now have a need for people to be able to stop psychopaths and serial killers? Sure, i can i can I can say that, but I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say that they were put in place, just that there is a there is an overarching theme with Jesus. What is it at a heart level? Right? We go through Matthew 5 through 7, and it lists all of these things. You've heard it taught this. Well, really, this is what it means, and this and that, and it's getting down to love God, love others. And yes, there are people that exist in this world that make that an impossibility in the pure sense of the phrase. And it's not your choice, it is their choice that they have acted in aggression or violence or whatever the case may be. Again, these things are examples of how it shouldn't have been. And I would say the same thing about any military, about any police force, about any of them, regardless of country, regardless of. So, no, this is not just another example of me taking a shot at America. Stick around long enough. There will be plenty, I'm sure, at some point. I don't even know. I don't even have any plan, but I'm sure they're going to come up at some point. I'm not quiet about that. But any of these forces are an example of how it and so if then you take this whole idea of Jesus and what's at the heart of the matter, and then you pull it into, okay, sociologically, how do you deal with people and government powers and all of that jazz? The modus operandi stays the same. It stays consistent. So, for my fellow anti establishment brothers and sisters, no, Jesus isn't calling for us to tear down the system and burn it all down either. Because I've heard that argument too. He's not speaking to the efficacy either direction. It's speaking to this idea of, okay, if you are in that land, live by the customs, live in accordance, live in submission to the to the governmental powers and all of that jazz, as a form of living at peace with the people around you. Now, for me, this subject a lot more complicated the second that I started doing international ministry, because some areas in which I preach, some avenues in which I speak, and some outlets in which I pastor, if I go off and say to everybody universally, live in submission to your governmental power, I'm going to get people killed. Like that's a real thing. Like this is not this is not the same deal as in the US. I may gripe and moan and groan, and I may be looking for dual citizenship, and I may be doing all of those things, but I also understand that I'm sitting here in front of a camera and there's nobody knocking at my door based off of what I'm saying or based off of the fact that I have the stances that I have. I get that. It's not, and so when you process these pieces of scripture, for me, again, we go back to what did we say at earlier on in the conversation? Our experiences shade how we process different things. And so for me, when I look at the presence of the authority figure, I see no connection with God providing this, just that submission as a form of peace is a position that we are called to.
Yeah, I agree with that piece of it, that submission as a form of peace. And I feel like Romans talks about that too. Basically, like if if you disobey the laws and you disobey what the government said, then you can expect to be punished. Like you can expect that. So I get that. Um, but at the same time, here's a couple things that I would say. I'm trying to because you said a lot of things that I want to kind of respond to. The first thing I want to respond to is I agree. A lot of our authority, government, they are humans too. They're human too, and they live in this fallen world too, and so they get a lot of things jacked up and wrong. And so, I was gonna ask you, so I'm glad you clarified that God's not calling us to overtake them either, right? Um, so, but I wanted to highlight that to say the same thing about getting us back on the gun thing. That is the same rationale of you take away all the guns from the law-abiding citizens, they're still the messed up people who gonna do evil and do wrong, right? So we're still living in this fallen world. So that to me, the answer is not to take away all the guns from the law-abiding citizens. No more it is to shut down the government because they're corrupt or they're wrong or they could be, right, or the system. So I want to say that. Then the other thing I want to say was, um, God used all things to do His will. Even people who are doing wrong and ugly and evil, God will take that ugly and evil to do His will. And so I 100% agree with you on, because we're in a fallen world, because of the way things are now, there is a need for protection outlets and authorities and the whole nine. The only piece that I slightly disagree with you on is saying that I don't know that God has put them in place and do it, and the reason why I say that, one, is because the Bible says it says it. Romans 13, it says that the authorities that was established were established by God. Mostly probably because we live in a fallen world and it's needed. But then two, just because somebody is corrupt and evil doesn't mean that God didn't have a hand and putting that person in there, right? Because you have like the whole book of Judges, all those jokers got it messed up, but they were put in place. You have Saul who messed up and was put in place. David who messed up and he, and he was put in by God. The only person who walked this earth who lived perfectly, that was Jesus, right? So everybody else that God have used and done, they had their shortcomings and their fallings. And I feel like the book of Judges and Kings highlight that for us clearly, clearly, which is why we need Jesus, which is why, you see what I'm saying? Because man just couldn't get it right. So just because they're wrong and they're sinning and they got their own evil plans doesn't mean that God's hand is not in the establishment or the government or whatever we want to call it, because it was the same thing even when God was just dealing with just the Israelites. When Jesus talked to them about divorce, like, well, why did Moses allow divorce? You see what I'm saying? And that wasn't God's will. God didn't have a will for that, but because of, like you said, because of man's sin, because of the way we are, God allowed certain things and put certain things in place so that way, because I don't think it's God's will for there to be slaves and for another person to be over somebody. But because that was the way of their world, in God put boundaries and rules on how they deal with their slaves. And so,
Right.
to me, I think this gets to the whole Colossians, and I believe Ephesians talks about this, where it says, "Hey, obey your masters, right? Obey your masters or whatever, because you ultimately you got to answer to God." And then he reminds the masters, "Oh, well, don't trip, don't get power hungry, because you got to answer to me too." You see what I'm saying? So to me, I feel like even though the government is jacked up, they're just going to be held to a higher standard. They are. They're gonna when they have to answer to God, they're gonna have to answer to why did they rule unjustly, or why did they rule with greed, or why did they rule with, just like a pastor is gonna have to answer to the way he taught and the way he led his flock, right? And so, to me, I'm not, and I want to be clear, I'm not saying that God co-signs people who get in power and do wrong. I think they're going to be punished and be held accountable too. But at the same time, God made it to where, because the world we live in, there's got to be some people who can, like judges, they got to be able to sentence people. There got to be people to be able to uphold law and order. And and the Bible just says it. I mean, I'm trying to find the Bible verse. I think it's Romans 13, right? Where it said the authorities exist, they're established by God. And so I was gonna do a video on this, because a lot of people, with the election coming up or whatever, you get the whole, well, if you're a Christian, you shouldn't vote Democrat, or well,
Right.
if you're a Christian, you shouldn't vote the other way. But and I don't even want to get into that, because I don't, that's a whole different thing. But what I will say is, God may allow a joker who is not a Christian whatsoever to be in power, and we don't have the overarching blueprint to know what God is going to do in that situation. With that situation, you see what I'm saying? Because there is biblical examples of God using ungodly leaders to for his will to happen. And so we in America, I don't think we are exempt. And so I don't look at, like, I'll be the first one to tell you, I feel like our Congress members, our politicians, they enact laws on us that they themselves don't even intend on following
Yep.
and doing. And it's wrong. And I think they're going to have to answer for that.
Yep.
But at the same time, me as a Christian, that doesn't give me the right to not obey them and follow them or whatever. I got to, just like I got to leave vengeance for God with my enemy who's breaking the law trying to kill me. I got to leave that room for God to handle the government for their shortcomings too. That's my view on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a compelling argument, and I see exactly where you're coming from. I just would view it in the same way that if I haven't gotten myself into trouble yet, let's go ahead and pull out another one. I view it like how I view this whole topic of inerrancy in the scriptures, and what it means to have an inerrant scripture and all of that. Now, you notice how every single one of those references to inerrancy are about the scriptures, but none of them mention they will be inerrant for all translations, for all time, for all of these. You know what I'm saying? And at this point, we have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. Don't get me wrong. I believe the Bible is God breathed. I believe I believe in the validity of Scripture, but I don't need it to be word for word, punctuation for punctuation, translation for translation, perfect in order for it to have that validity. So I believe that the originals, I believe that the original teaching, the original copy, the original, like Paul's original letters, the original books, the original inerrant. I think the scriptures speak to that. But that's not what we have when we pull out our phones. It's not what we have when we pull out our scriptures. It's not what we have with cops when we're looking at something like this. So I wouldn't take it that far. I think there are examples of God's hands being in what officials are doing what, or what, who has power, or the grand design of things. Absolutely. And I'm sure countless examples that nobody will ever know about of God orchestrating things, or having, like, putting things on people's hearts and all of that sort of jazz. Those are all things that God is consistent. God is the same now, then, and forever. So can he? Without a doubt. I also have seen too much darkness in this world for me to believe that every single thing like that, even the people that are bad actors or good actors, are placed there. I think there has been a need for defenders for some time. The problem, though, with then bringing that forward all the way to authorities in the modern sense, is now you're talking about an entirely different system. You're talking about a system that is built on pseudo Christianity, and a system that has been uncovered and very honest about the fact that they want people who are suggestible. Now, I don't know. I will be the first one to admit to anybody who has made it to that role by way of the military. I honestly cannot tell you if it's the same deal. This has been research specifically into, like, local area police departments rather than like military police. So I'm not speaking for everybody universally here. But when it's an authority figure that then is a part of an overarching system of man, I'm not sure that holds the same cachet as the the systems that Jesus was referring to, or that the Bible is referring to, Paul is referring to. Like, I think the way of being remains the same. That's why I went immediately before to submission as a form of peace, because I think what we're being called to in acting in accordance with the laws of the land, that still is part of the topic that needs to be brought in. But the actual roles of the individuals, I just, I wouldn't, I would make some of the same plays that you made. I just wouldn't take the ball as far down the field.
Yeah, so let's break that down just a little bit. So let's go back into the context of where they were at in this time. There were essentially, when Paul was talking to the Romans, and he said that the authorities that exist have been established by God. There were two authorities in their time. It was, so one, you had the Israelites, right? You had the Jewish people, and they had their king, their well, Man, I know I'm speaking a lot of generals here, but the point that I'm making is that the Israelites had their way of doing things based off of the law and what Moses and Abraham and their fathers and all that established. But at the same time, at this point, you had Pharisees and Sadducees and all these people who were taking it to a level that was not in God's will. They start adding their own laws or their own understandings of the law in there. That still doesn't negate the fact that it was established by God. Then the other authorities that you had was the Roman authority, who was completely against God. They were, I mean, I would rather deal with our government that we have now than be a Jewish person having to deal with Roman authorities back then. At least from my readings, right? From what I read, and so they were completely against it as well. And so again, even in that context, you have bad people. I have to say bad subjective. You have people who are going against God's will, who are in positions of power, and Jesus, Paul, they're teaching us to obey them. And I think the reason why is it goes back and it speaks to a lot of what you're saying is that, we as Christians should, and followers of God, should act differently than the other average Joe, because that is what's going to show people the radical grace of God. So even though our authorities are in the wrong, they were still put in a position, according to Romans 13, 1 or 2, in a position that was established by God. I would even say, I would even go for to say allowed by God, because when you use the word place, and I don't know that I would say that God placed certain people there either and that kind of stuff, but I will say he allowed certain things, and then now that it happened, he's going to use it for his will. And so us, the Christians or the followers of God, we have a way that we should behave and act in that. And so an example I would use is when they tried to trip up Jesus with the coin, right? And God, he said, give to God what is God's. So we as Christians and followers of Christ, we have to follow the teachings of God and what God asks us to do. But also we have to follow the laws and the rules of our land. Now, they could be completely wrong in what they're doing, and that's going to be between them and God. But we have to obey, whether that's to live by peace or if that's just to obey our God, because our God told us to obey the authorities, right? And so Jesus could have easily been like, nope, don't pay your taxes to him because you report to God. But he's like, no, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, pay your taxes to Caesar, do the whole nine, but also abide by God. And so in these situations, that's why I typically kind of go back to Daniel. Whenever I start thinking about this, I try to go back and look at Daniel, because I feel like Daniel was in a position where he was following some ungodly leaders. He was under some ungodly leadership, and somehow Daniel still pleased God and obeyed God, but he also rose in the ranks of this ungodly political government system. And it wasn't until that ungodly political system tried to force him to do something that clearly went against God is when he rebelled and went against them. Other than that, he studied what they told him to study. He learned what he told him to learn. He was like second in command or something like that. So he had to have obviously operated within their guidelines and their rules. But once they told him he can't pray to God and that he got to bow down to another person, he completely changed. So all I'm saying is, I don't know if I would use the word God place the leaders that was over Daniel there, but he definitely allowed that type of structure to be done to do whatever his will was going to be. And then you got somebody like Daniel who gives us an example of how you can be in a completely ungodly political situation, still abide by them. And if we want to say it's for peace, he kept the peace or whatever, he followed their laws to minimize what would happen to him and his friends. But then eventually it got to a point where that government crossed the line and had him go against God. And I think that is where the line is drawn when it comes to our government, whether they're right or wrong with all the other stuff they do. If it's not a direct commandment from God that they're telling us to go against, then we gotta obey them. We gotta follow their ways or whatever. But then when it comes to God, God is over that. So same thing with a woman uh, with her husband. He's supposed to be the head. He's supposed to be running his house a godly way. She should be under his submission unless he start having her do stuff that goes against God. Same thing with kids. God, Jesus himself said, if you don't hate your mother and father, the context of that was not to actually hate them because God don't cause to hate anybody. It was if they try to turn you away from me, then you're not supposed to follow your mother and father. Again, I think these are all examples of if we're in a situation where there's an authority figure over us, as Christians, we should obey that authority figure unless it goes against, unless it turns us against God. That is where the line is drawn, and so that's my view on it.
So the one I will say is its own conversation, and I will openly state that I disagree hard. Is pulling in the marital roles and gender roles into it. This one in terms of the pre-established idea of following an authority, to pull that in at best is risky at best. But again, I'm not sure anybody watching that really understands any measure of where I plant certain peg marks would be any kind of surprised to hear me say that. But again, that's its own conversation. Um, yeah, I think we're working with the same piece of canvas. I just think we're making two different pictures out of it, because I still can't pull it forward past the context of 12 and 13, Romans 12 and 13, about the idea of not seeking personal vengeance by being by a call to being at that time. And I think for me, I can't pull in any of the other stuff because I don't see it. I don't see it in scripture. I think that that was a call because to a group of Jews that at that point in history would not acknowledge a king and would only say that the only authority is God. That they would not acknowledge a king.
But
Don't.
but can't you see how then that would be the case with almost everything in the Bible? Again, I'm not sitting here saying that there's an apples to apples comparison to their government to our government. What I'm
Right.
saying is the Bible teaches us things and there's something we should learn from that, and then we have to use wisdom on how that applies to us today. So yes, their government was 1,000 times different than ours now, and they were dealing with a certain scenario and thing, but it still doesn't take away the fact that, and it's not just in Romans, Colossians and Ephesians teach this as well. Hebrews talks about it as well. It doesn't change the fact that we as followers of Christ should behave in a different way than people who are not followers of Christ. And a part of that is being respectful to authority. That
Yeah. So like I said, 75, 80%, maybe even more of the topic is all stuff that we agree on. Like it's handling it in the context of modernization that you and I go in two different directions. And I would agree that there are tons of examples where it's not an apples for apples thing. We take what we take from it, we take the core principle and move on, sort of thing. That's absolutely. So again, easily probably 80% plus. We agree on as far as that goes. I just I don't know if it's the sovereignty language that I can hear, or what exactly it is, but there is some, if we dug deep enough, there is some point in the conversation where we go in two different directions. So I see how somebody sees this and goes modern with it, with the mod, like this is and I'm not even saying that that in and of itself is wrong. I just don't know as though we can still clearly state that all of these governmental authorities are God ordained. That's heavy lifting. That's too that to me colors too far out of the lines and goes too far into, at best, speculation.
Yeah.
And
I
but that
think I
being
agree
said,
with you on that. Like I said, ordained place. I think I would say they're God allowed. That God allowed them to happen. I believe that there are tons of things in place, not just governments, right? But even churches, right? There's churches and the way they handle leadership. There's schools and the way they treat people and handle stuff. There's I believe there's parents who completely treat their kids in a horribly ungodly way, right?
yeah,
All I'm saying is God has allowed for there to be authority figures in our life, whether it's government, parents, schools, judges, whatever, however you want to look at it. He has allowed it. I wouldn't say, I don't know that I would go far and go with the whole sovereign thing either. Like it was destined from the beginning of time that this guy is going to be in this. I don't know if I'll
yeah,
go that far, but what I will say is that we live in a fallen world. God has allowed a lot of people to get away with a lot of things because he has grace, and he wants to see us come to know him and be saved. And because of that, we have these political authority things in place, and God is telling the people that follow him, hey, I want you to be different. I want you to respect them. I want you to, abide by them. And I think the line gets drawn when they tell us to go against God, right?
yeah.
Outside of that, we should be at best, like you said, trying to live in peace, is trying to show love and grace to those people. So I wouldn't take it to the whole sovereignty ordained thing either. I wouldn't go that far either.
Yeah, I am and it's possible that part of what I'm subconsciously reacting to, maybe if I sit with this long enough, is it tends to be a hop, skip, and a jump at this point to say things like every single national leader is God ordained or God appointed or something along some word. You know what I mean? We're not in that neighborhood, but we're also like in the suburbs of that neighborhood. You know what I mean? And that's where, like, that goes back to where we started the conversation, because yes, you need to start the conversation at, okay, no, God does not appoint every single national leader. Also, God didn't tell you to vote a certain way. Also, God didn't tell you to vote. Also, God didn't give us America on a silver platter because it's his favorite country or anything like that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, we got to go through all of the stuff because we have this thing called Christian nationalism. We have this group of people walking around like we are God's favorite nation and all of that kind of stuff. And all I'm going to say is, please show me one time, one place, one solitary place where America exists in the Bible. Just let that sink in. Just sit with that. Don't try to answer the question. Just sit with the fact that America does not exist in Scripture. Anyway, um,
Yeah, that's
it's
good. I mean, that's a very. I've often read the Bible and wonder about that, man. I
yeah,
really do.
yeah,
Like, I don't want to take this conversation because we could take this down a whole nother different path.
yeah,
But as I sit back and look at the direction of where America is going right now,
yeah,
and I could see how we haven't been mentioned in the Bible, so I'll just leave it at that.
So, and one of the things that I think pulls into my mind when I look at this, and it absolutely calloused me when I realized, is, so millennials catch a bad rap for being a generation that doesn't want to progress, that wants to stay in the 90s. Okay, think about this for a second. The 90s, for my generation, the 90s was the only time that we were told that the world is a great place. If you largely think of the 90s, there was a lot of things in certain for certain people that were showcased in the best light possible. Not for everybody, not everybody's experience, not no one person's experience is universal, yada yada yada. I'm saying that there's a lot of us that grew up with, this is the like the America, the world is doing well. Then Y2K happened. No, sorry, let me back up one. Then Columbine happened. Then Y2K happened. Then 9/11 happened. Then a million other school shootings happened. And then the recession. And it was it was thing after thing after thing after thing after thing. So you see millennials that are stuck in the 90s, it's because it was the last time that they felt safe. And so this idea of a politicized view of scripture or of God or of the state of what God would prefer or anything else like that is laughable to me. And I know that that's not the direction, even with the areas that we disagree. I understand. I'm not trying to then turn around and say, "Oh, you're being patriotic," because the more I've gotten to know you, the more I realize that um, you don't see a half full or a half empty glass of water. You just see a glass of water. Like I just see a glass of water. You know what I mean? But I think there's a lot of, to me, the more compelling part of it, the most compelling part of this, when we talk about what we ought to do or what we should do or how we should process this or any of that sort of stuff, is that theology piece of, what mentality do I have about the other person? When I am brandishing a gun, when I am thinking about getting a gun, when I am thinking about home defense, when I am thinking about the idea of someone coming through my door, what is my heart posture about that person in all of that? That to me is the most compelling part of the conversation, because the rest of it's nonsense. The rest of it is taking stances and and falling for the echo chamber, falling for the facade of, there's a whole group of people that are around you cheering you on and riling you up. Yo, it's like four people, but social media is doing its thing because it wants you to stay on the platform. See through the white noise. I beg of you, see into the matrix. Understand that all of these people, that you've got the 87 signs, which seriously, I'm just going to throw this out there because this is the airways are open and I get to do this. Why 17 signage for whatever candidate why? Like, oh, what? Okay, so you know what I'm gonna do? One's not gonna get him. Two, still not good. But if I put five of those things in my yard, I'm gonna convert somebody to the right side. Come on, man. Like that, it's a whole mentality that I will never actually understand. But anyway, um
I wonder. I never put any. I wonder if they donated certain a certain amount and they get so many of them when they donate, so they just put
right.
them all out there. I don't know. Or yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't get that either. I just laugh at it.
So you know how on holidays people put like door hangs on doors that's like they're made of like cling wrap, sort of stuff. Like Halloween, it'll be a skeleton. Christmas, it'll be whatever. Um, no word of lie. Watch or saw somebody with a door hang like that of Trump, just full from the top of the door frame to the bottom of the door frame. It's just Trump on their door. I'm like, I, there's a sucker born every minute, and apparently at that point he won the luck of the draw. Like, I don't know what to tell you.
Man, we could do a whole show on what I believe is idols in America, right?
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and that just give me the whole idol
Hmm.
vibe, which
See
is
that?
clearly
See that's but see, you hit on something intriguing, and that's why I think when if we get out from just the plain old topic of whether or not God is telling us in the Bible to brandish AK-47s, to that is where I think it's more significant. That's where I think it's more of more resonant to the conversation to say how many people is your gun your idol, or the freedom to be able to have your gun, is that an idol? You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like that, like all any point in this can be an idol. And that's why I think if you're gonna be authentic to the conversation, you can't be one size fits all. You can't be guns bad, take them all away, guns good, should have small armaments and all that jazz. I will say, I don't, I like past a certain point. Like, I'm not gonna. I'm my job is to not act as the moral authority for everybody's household. I don't know where everybody lives. I don't know everybody's circumstances. I don't know everybody's situations. My job, this world, trust and believe. Even for you folks watching that call me pastor, the world is a better place that I'm not in control of it. Just throwing that out there. And so I got enough on my plate with my house and my responsibilities than to speaking for whatever everybody else should be doing with their house and stuff like that. I have yet to, other than pride, other than fanaticism, I've yet to see a legitimate argument for the need for automatic weapons. I not in the hands, like you're talking about two countries forces killing each other on a battlefield and all this jazz and whatever. That's a different conversation. That sits over there. That is a different scenario than, Jim Bob down the road looking like he's trying to arm a third world country when in his gun chest. You know what I mean? Like that sort of thing. It's not, because again, escalation. Again, what is your heart posture and your mentality? Because I see I'm way more flexible if what you're brandishing is a handgun. You walk around with you hit that trigger one time and 8 bullets come out of it. Yo,
yeah,
like at some point you've got to admit to the fact that you have one singular focus in mind when using it. And
yeah,
I understand there are a whole group of people that hear that and are like, yep, because it's my area and it's my house and it's mine, it's mine, it's mine. Do we see the problem in the mentality, even when it comes down to our possessions?
yeah.
Uh,
No,
don't get me
I
wrong,
agree.
I handled the home invasion situation that I mentioned towards the top of the show. I handled it in a certain kind of way. It's not like I just let them ransack my house. So it's not like I'm unaware of the idea of defending yourself. But again, I go back to, at what point are you defending yourself, and at what point is your singular sole focus to destroy, maim, and kill your enemy?
Yeah, the Bible say be angry, don't sin, right? So I, I'm I'm gonna speak for me personally. 'Cause like you said, we can't speak for everybody, but for me personally, I own we own two guns right now. Both of them are pistols. I don't have an automatic weapon, but I'm a lot like you, Joe, when it comes to I feel like a man should just be able to defend himself without a gun, right? Um, or a person, period. I won't even just
Yeah.
say a man, a person, period. And so most of my life, I didn't have a gun. Matter of fact, when I lived in Atlanta, that whole time that I didn't have a weapon, I didn't get a gun until, to be honest, I want to say it was because we're in the military, we started moving a lot, and so me and my family will be on the road, or we'll be certain places where I just don't know the area, and I wanted to be able to defend my family. Half of the time, I don't have my gun on me, right? Which is like I was telling my wife the other day, because it seemed like every other day here in Texas, there's some kind of shooting in the Walmart or something's going on. I'm like, man, we probably better start taking our gun out with us, right? But we most of the time we don't. Most of the time we forget it. We leave it at the house. We don't have it. I would have to go through a couple of steps to use it if somebody came into my house, mainly because I'm confident enough that in most situations I could probably protect myself without it, right?
Yeah.
So that's my view, my stand. Another reason when it gets to the automatic weapons and all that, and I'm bringing this up for a reason because earlier we talked about me trying to be more empathetic. I do have an anger problem, right? And so whether I got a gun or whether I'm using my hand, if somebody did something to me, I have been asking God to help me have the strength not to do something, not to take it overboard, right? Because even when I'm dealing with, like, if say I'm trying to share the gospel with somebody and they're coming at me, I feel the anger and the emotions getting build up, and so
Yep.
I'm like, I need to be able to be better than that. I need to be able to have a conversation with somebody about Christ, knowing they may come against me, and I got to be able to control my anger. And so a lot of times why I don't have a gun on me is because I don't want to end up in jail. I don't want to do something stupid with it or whatever. And so I won't, me personally, I won't go out and spend a whole bunch of money on weapons because of I'm just the kind of person where like when I spend money on something, I like to use it. So I can't see me spending a whole bunch of money on a whole armory of guns that just sit in my. There's no point of it. But what I will say is, and you brought this up. You said, "What is your heart and your intentions when you have that gun and when you have it?" This is where I'm gonna be transparent and vulnerable and say this is an area where God need to work with me on. My daughter just moved into an apartment. She's in college. She just got her first own apartment. She's out there by herself in Atlanta. I'm her dad who wants to love and protect my daughter. So all I can think about is if some joker follow her home at night or somebody try to kick into her door and come into her house, I want her to be able to have the ability to defend herself, right? And so I've already talked to her about having mace. At least have some mace with you when you're going places. But then also too, I do want to get her a shotgun for home defense because one with a shotgun, she ain't got to be that. She don't have to be that accurate, right? If somebody coming to her door and it buckshots come out, she's gonna be able to stop that threat before they can harm her. Here's where I would say I need to have probably more faith in God, but we do live in a fallen world. I will say my heart posture right there is to protect my daughter and my thought process. I mean, that's my thought process. That's where my priority is. My heart is not necessarily for that joker who may come into our house in that scenario. And I can be man enough to admit that that is a, I don't know if that's a flaw or not. I don't know if that's just a human response to her being my daughter. But in my heart posture is I feel it's better them than my daughter, which is wrong to have. But at the same time, I know my daughter is not out there purposely trying to cause somebody harm. So if you're coming to purposely cause her harm, I want her to be in a position, since I can't be there to defend her, to be able to defend herself. Like, and I can't help that that's how I feel for my daughter as a father. Now we can get into the theological debate of whether I'm right or wrong in that. That's something I will pray to the Holy Spirit about and talk to God about and try to understand. But there is, and I will admit, me wanting to get her a shotgun is coming from a place of fear, coming from a place of lack of control. I can admit that, but at the same time, that's just an area where I still need God's help in because all I could think about is my 20-year-old daughter who weigh about 90 pounds
Mhm.
going to a home by herself and some idiot trying to take advantage of
Right.
of that.
Right. Yeah, and I applaud the transparency. I do. I applaud I applaud the willingness to just say, yeah, this is this is what goes through my head, and at this point in time, I don't have a better answer for you, and this is just this is where I'm at. And I think that if more folks in public conversation could approach with some form of humility or honesty or transparency, I think we would get further because more people would understand that we are all on journeys as far as all of this goes. You know what I mean? I think part of the reason why I kind of one of the steps along in the road, because there's a lot of things that just kind of naturally picked up from each other as to why I still stand oriented against guns for the most part. um is, yeah, I used to be a really angry dude, and um God and trauma counseling have helped me to be able to start to put language to things that were dramatic and things that are not dramatic, traumatic. That things that that are just misplaced passion and different things like that, and just tempering the emotions that are involved. And so yeah, there was a period of time where I was like, I shouldn't, I'm not responsible enough. You know what I mean? I should not have a gun for the betterment of me and other people, and I really don't like the idea of prison. And so um it's something that I that's to anybody who processes, should I or shouldn't I? One of the first things that you need to do is ask those kinds of questions. Be honest about it. Be willing to be honest about where you're at, who you are, what your circumstances are, what your heart posture is, and all of that. Like, looking at the full and complete picture is how you will be able to actually come to an authentic conclusion. That conclusion does not mean that every I is dotted, every T is crossed, and every malformed part of your identity is in alignment with Christ. It just simply means that you are aware of who you are aware of what God is doing, you are aware of where your heart is. And that's what so much of this topic comes down to, is how you are viewing yourself, other people, God, the whys of it, the circumstances of it, all of that kind of stuff. Because whether it's a fraction that's influencing everything, or a giant spot where it is so evident, if your heart posture, your mentality, your positioning is not in alignment with God in all of that, that's something that needs to be addressed. And whether or not you own a gun, or whether or not guns are okay, are it is an entirely different matter. And or it's just an aspect of that. It's just something that is subject to whatever that heart posture issue is. And you notice how in none of this we got into the, one of the big topics that centered around this conversation is, should should there be an armed individual at every school? If a teacher had a gun, should they, blah blah blah. The issue is, it's not going to be a big heavily guarded secret on who that individual is. So again, nothing about what we've said changes. It's just a sociological debate that ultimately has no rooting in what God says should be a thing. It's simply humans' stances and humans' opinions. And we happen to have a system that that openly states that it allows people the ability to be able to cast their opinion in a formalized way. I'll say it like that.
Yeah. So here's my thoughts on that. I honestly don't know where I stand on should teachers be able to carry or not.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I do know where I stand. I think, in my personal opinion, this is my personal opinion. My
Mhm.
personal opinion is that it shouldn't be prohibited. I don't know if I would say it should be allowed, but I don't know if I would say they should arm teachers. I think a
Right.
well responsible person, I think they shouldn't be prohibited
Yeah.
to have it there. And here's why. I'm gonna tell you exactly why. And I'm surprised this didn't come up early in the conversation. I lived in LA, man. And one of the things that killed me about LA, the weather's good, weather's nice. They got some really strict laws out there, especially when it comes to gun laws. It is very hard to own a weapon out there, to carry a
Mhm.
weapon. But what's so funny is LA is known for its gang culture. Like, before I moved to LA, I was always like, man, what color clothes should I wear? How should I act? Because Hollywood would show you, Crips, Bloods, the whole nine, whatever, whatever. And I'm like, how can somewhere that's so infested with criminal gang activity, they make it so hard for law-abiding citizens to protect themselves, right? That was just mind-boggling to me. And I think the time I felt the most vulnerable in LA is when I'm getting off of work in my military uniform, driving home. Because every single criminal knows that I'm not supposed to have a weapon on me coming on that base and coming in and out of there, right? So if you, and I don't even know if I should even be openly saying this online because it may give some idiot an idea. But that's when a military member is most vulnerable. You get off of work and go stop and get gas. You're technically not supposed to have your weapon on you because you went through the gate. You went through the base,
Mhm.
right? And so if you're out there without your weapon, big target, I'm in the military, so I got some kind of money. I'm doing whatever. I am in a position. I have just officially given the person who don't want to follow the law an advantage over me, and it's making me like a huge target. So when you say parks, schools, churches, when you publicly advertise that it is prohibited to have a weapon there, if I'm a robber, if I'm somebody who want to break the law, I want to increase my chances of being successful. So I'm going to do it on people who who uh who may not be able to fight back and defend. So to me, I feel like that puts them at a huge disadvantage. And so that's why I say I don't know that I would. I don't know that I agree to make it publicly known that it's prohibited to have a weapon in those areas because it does make you kind of like a sitting duck or whatever, or a target, if you will. And so to me, I think if teachers who were trained to conceal carry and all that, they were allowed to do it. Not necessarily they were told they have to or they should. They were allowed to. It will make a criminal think twice because they don't know if that person's gonna be shooting back. Again, somebody's still gonna do what they want to do. People gonna still try to. There are people who shoot at cops and know they got a gun. So I'm not saying it's gonna fix everything. But what I am saying is, if I'm a criminal and I know you don't have a weapon, I'd rather target you versus the person who does have a weapon.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is where I'm glad that we can have the theological side of the conversation, or the theological side of the conversation separate from the sociological side of the conversation, because this is firmly and completely the sociological side of the conversation, where two men of God can just disagree, because I think widespread statistics, like when you're talking about an individual, if you have an archetype in mind for this person who is not prohibited, and what this model of person would look like, The issue is you've opened the door to everybody, and you don't know whether or not you're going to get that model of person. And
Yeah,
so now you've opened the door. And again, I understand. I have been entrenched in this side of the conversation for long enough that I fully and completely understand all of the, or at least many of the responses that tend to come, that bad actors have already opened up that door, at
yeah,
least then you're giving people a fighting chance, and all this stuff. The problem though is it's all still subject to humanity. It's all still subject to the fact that, like, I think of some of the teachers that I saw and how big of creeps they were, and hitting on women, or the dumb jock mentality with some of them, that they would handle things in a certain kind of way, and just the things that happen to students. And then you add the volatility of having a potential for one of these to be armed. It you and then it takes one person to know who that is, tells another person, tells another person, tells another person, tells another person, and now they're public spectacle, and they are known as the one who carries their gun and is armed. And you've essentially defeated the purpose. You've just turned that person into the target. So now I know exactly who I need to go after. You know what I mean? There's no, it doesn't actually fix anything. It puts a butterfly on a giant gaping wound from my perspective. It's just, there's a fire. So what are we going to do? We're going to try to put the fire out with more kerosene. You know what I mean? You hope that somebody, with the person with the gun, is a law abiding citizen, but there's literally no stopgap measure to prove that, because somebody can, the most prolific serial killers have been normal everyday people. What's the first thing most families say when confronted with a family member? No, they
not
couldn't have,
them. Yeah,
not them. Come on. Like that. So again, I think, and this is where I go back to some of my overarching problems with the entire concept of guns, is it's a circular argument that has, like, you can't unring the bell. Like firearms are a thing, so you can't really unring the bell, but you have to. I don't say anybody has to, but I look at the situation and say it's a net negative to have guns at all, because of the fact that they cause more harm than good. Just they cause more harm than good. Yes, we can display the idea of situations where they can cause good. Absolutely. But if every single solitary example also comes with the counterbalance of it forces a wide net to be cast, that all of these people now can be, how much more problem have you started for yourself? And at what point do we have to say that the system is the problem? The gun is a piece of metal with mechanics to it that shoots projectiles. It is not inherently good or evil. It is simply a thing that exists in our world.
yeah. So let me ask you this: in the case of a school, though, if if you feel like allowing teachers to carry um will enhance the problem, what do you do then? Like, I guess, what would you, in a perfect world, what would you recommend to protect children from
So
shooters?
there's a
So
couple so there's a couple of different layers to the answer. I will only touch on the really deep one because we don't have this kind of time. I have thoughts that would overhaul the entirety of the US education system. I think public school systems, and the idea of sending kids to school for that chunk of time, and just the entire way that school is done, is tore up from the floor up. I think the whole thing is a giant joke in this country. So that part of it is a wholesale restructuring of that. Like, but outside of that, to work within the system that already exists. Um, the closest that I would come is to arming somebody, if that's the answer, is a security officer. I still don't like it.
Yeah.
I'm still not necessarily going to jump to advocating it. But if that is the answer, then you don't open it to all the teachers. You open it to one individual. That's it.
Hmm.
From that point, you start to get into the procedures that are in place. I am one of those people that I saw and fully understood post Columbine metal detectors, bag searches, the whole 9 yards. I got it. It wasn't lost on me as to what they were doing because something tragic had happened, and we have a system in place that has all of these different classes and all of these different materials that you necessitate somebody carrying those materials in something like a bag. Again, we go back to restructuring. That's really the biggest thing of restructuring how education is done. Would seriously eliminate a lot of just the opportunity.
Yeah. You
Now,
know, I could see like I can get on board with like a security, but I wouldn't say just one person. I would say more like a single point of entry to get to the school. So like a gate, a
yep,
guard
yep,
gate member or whatever, just like on a military base, or if you go to any like courthouse or whatever, you gotta go through security before you can get to certain areas. I think if I agree with you, like if you're gonna force kids to be in a public school situation, then you need to
yep.
pony up the money to protect them, just like you will protect the White House, you'll protect the military base, you'll protect anywhere else. So, okay,
Yeah,
I was
I
just curious.
that is one part of the conversation that I think is that I think like that is one thing that I would change. All schools universally, seriously, one single point of entry. That's it. And not like and don't have the button because most schools you got to hit the button and then you talk to somebody on an intercom and you come in while school's in session and that's kind of how it's done. Um the problem is that person on the other side of the intercom, the person who's buzzing you in should not be some secretary. That should not be a person in the main office who doesn't like just as long as you aren't incredibly suspect, you're coming through the door. No, you're defeating the purpose of having that lock on the door if you're just going to unlock it every 2 seconds. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
thinking through the protective measures that should be in place does way more for the safety of a kid than just saying let's not change anything except for adding more guns into the situation. And that's where I tend to have a problem with the argument a lot of the time is it just gets reduced down to more guns equal more safety. And literally the entirety of human history would like a word. From the very moment that we had things that we could throw at other people, the entirety of human history from that point on would like a word because that's not how humans have done it ever.
Yeah. And it's getting worse now, man. Like with well, as far as the way we can cause harm to one another with this whole
Yep.
AI and technology,
Oh yeah.
it doesn't like I feel like it doesn't matter how many guns you have. If I have the power to control AI or technology, your gun is gonna be worthless
Yep.
eventually.
Yeah. Eventually, the conversation is going to move away from physical violence. It'll never be, obviously, never be completely a non-factor, but the battlefield is going to technology 100%,
Yep.
especially as you start to progress voice simulation and all that jazz.
Yeah.
So, any closing thoughts before we wrap it up?
No, I guess my closing thought would be wherever you stand on it, if you're a Christian, check your heart. Right. That as simple as that. If you whether you think you should have guns or not have guns, check your heart. What's your heart posture? Are you operating in fear? Are you operating in anger? Are you operating in revenge? Are you operating in pride? Do you have an idol? Is it like I just want to protect my idols? Whatever that case may be. And try to operate more like Jesus would. I understand we live in a world where that is difficult and it's hard, but we as Christians are called to do the hard things, to go the opposite way of the world. And so I'm not going to tell a person whether they should or should not have a gun, but what I will
Yeah.
say as a Christian, you are called to treat your enemy a certain way. So just consider that.
Yep. Yep. It's the reality is whether you agree with me on the things that I stood out on, or you agreed with Rico on the things that he stood out on, or you thought that this was largely uneventful because we didn't sit here and go for the throat for 2 hours. Wherever you land in all of this, hopefully you were able to see that two people can come together, have an intelligent and pointed conversation about a topic without any necessity or burden to convert the other one into a different thought process or a different position or anything like that. Regardless of the situation and circumstance, when it comes to guns, weapons, anything like that, I'll echo it. Check your heart. Because the reality of community and loving your neighbor is so non-dependent of circumstance and situation. We need to come to grips with that. We need to come to grips with the fact that loving your neighbor and loving God, and by effect of loving God, engaging with people in a certain way, even people that have come against you, that all matters in this conversation. And so if you are somebody who gets hot under the collar about their right to have guns and somebody taking it away, start asking some questions. Why does it make you hot under the collar? Why are you feeling that way? What about it's triggering? All of that jazz. If you are somebody who wants to tear it all down, who wants to destroy the machine and it's all bad, ask why. Ask why you feel compelled to be the righteous voice that has a better idea on everything than everybody else. Ask yourself the question, what are you angry at? What has you so worked up? And there's there so that is going to be unique to your situation in your circumstance, but it matters. Investing at a heart level in this conversation matters. So,
Yeah.
with that, thank you all for joining us. We will be back next week, Friday, 9:30 a.m. Eastern, for Kingdom on the Road, where we will be starting the book of Deuteronomy, and then next week, Saturday, 9:30 a.m. Eastern, for another edition of Let It Rip. But for now, remember, you are prayed for, you are loved deeply.